So hello, everybody. It's 7 o'clock, and so we're welcoming our members that are out in the audience live in the room here at Campbell Center, and we also are welcoming our viewers on Zoom. So we're glad everybody's coming together for this program tonight. Lane County Audubon's October program, and my name is Mava Souls. I know most of you, but it's still nice to connect with any new people that are around, so we're very happy to see folks here. And we encourage you to peruse our books in the back and our membership stuff. If you're new to our group, you're welcome to take a free Lane County Audubon newsletter, The Quail, and find out more about us. Also ask us questions. We're happy to share information about our activities. We do have 2 bird walks a month every month, and the only month we don't do that is in December when we have the Eugene Christmas bird count. And then the program meetings is also now a great way to get together and see people again, that we're coming together in the room for the first time in a long time, well, second time in a long time. Please, if you're in the audience, silence your cell phones so they don't go off and wake us up. And then we have a donation box in the back. If you feel like, leaving a donation, that's great, because we're paying extra money for the room here at the Campbell Center, which we're very happy to be here. It's a nice parking area and a nice amenable area. So we're doing well with that. Also, our next program will be announced to you by Dennis when he comes and speaks to you. The only other thing, do we have a conservation announcement? I think Debbie Shalanoff will come up here and give you a conservation announcement. And we also have a save the date real quickly for the Eugene Christmas bird count. You'll be hearing more about that in the newsletter as it comes out for the November, but the save the date, the new Eugene Christmas bird count will be January 1st this year, which is kind of problematic for some people. But you stay up all night anyway, you might as well go out birding first thing in the morning. So there'll be more information coming out about that, but if you want to know about it, it's a great activity to participate in. Now here's Debbie to give us a conservation announcement. Thanks.
Hi, I have a very brief conservation announcement this time. In fact, it'll be a one-word announcement, and it's what you can do for conservation for the birds. And the announcement is vote. Actually, to make that a 2-word announcement, please vote. Okay.
Hi, my name is Ron Renshaw. I coordinate the booth activities that we have, and we're going to be at the Mushroom Festival Sunday. Is it October 30th, I believe is the date. And if you're interested in either getting on the mailing list for announcements about those opportunities, or you'd like to be there on Sunday for the Mushroom Festival for a 2-hour slot at our booth, we will be there. So I'll be at the back after the program, so let me know about that. So here's Dennis.
Okay, thank you. Well, before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'm going to tell you a little bit about next month, November 22nd. We're going to have Ram Papish back to speak to us. And I don't tell him, I don't say, what are you going to talk about or anything. I just tell Ram to please come and do a program for us. And he is one of those people who is always able to come up with some great programs for us. And this time, he's doing what he calls the reverse bucket list. How to Learn to Love Alligator Farms is his subtitle. And it's going to be roadside attractions, can be surprisingly great places to enjoy birds. This program explores the unexpected side of Florida's fabulous bird life. And so that's the description he gave me. What you can count on is learning something from somebody who knows a lot about birds. He's done a lot of research. He is somebody who does great photography, so you're going to see some wonderful photographs. And he is a fantastic storyteller. So please come and enjoy that. That'll be next month on the 4th Tuesday. Tonight, we're very happy to have with us someone all the way from Portland who drove down tonight. We're so happy that she was able to do that. She is a longtime member of the Portland Audubon Society, and she has been working with them first as the Assistant Conservation Director from 2008 to 2012. She graduated from Lewis and Clark College in 1997 and then spent 10 years studying raptors all over the West, and then joined the Audubon Society in Portland. She really focuses her time on urban environments and making them more hospitable to wildlife. She's the BirdSafe campaign coordinator with the Audubon Society up there. And she's also been working with the Oregon Zoo's California condor breeding program. And so you may have some questions about that after her presentation here tonight. Tonight, she's gonna talk more about urban lighting and how what we do in our cities affects migrating birds and other animals. And so with great happiness, I am glad to introduce Mary Coolidge.
Thank you, Dennis. Okay, so let's first of all do a volume check. How well can you hear me in the back? Does that sound good? Okay, great. Yeah, so thank you for the introduction, Dennis, and big thanks to Dennis and Debbie for getting me down here to do this talk. I haven't been to Eugene, admittedly, since the late 90s, and it feels so nostalgic for what Portland used to be like. So it's really nice to visit this city again after so many years. Yeah, so I'm Mary Coolidge. I run the BirdSafe program at Portland Audubon, focusing specifically on light pollution and window collisions as two primary hazards for birds in the built environment. And as Dennis mentioned, I also work in the California condor breeding program. I'm sorry that I'm going to drag you through a long talk before I let you ask me questions about that. But at the end, if you have some condor questions, I'm happy to entertain some of those as well. So I like to start with this photo. Does anybody notice anything interesting about this photo, first off? The stars. Okay, yeah. So this is a photo by Haroon Memedinovich and Gavin Heffernan. They are a duo that work together on a project called the Skyglow Project. They are astral photographers who were traveling the world to take starry night photos. And they really started to encounter light pollution in so many places that it became, I think, both of their life missions to help raise awareness about this growing issue. And this is a photo that they sandwiched together of a beautiful Milky Way sky over downtown LA. And I think that the thing about this photo that really captures my imagination, and hopefully yours too, is that it reminds us that there are stars in the sky over all of our brightest lit cities every night of the year. If only we could draw back that curtain of light pollution and maybe the curtain of clouds. It sounds like maybe rain that we're listening to. Light pollution is really a very critical issue for not only birds, particularly migrating birds, but whole ecosystems. And we're going to talk about that tonight. But it's also something that we can solve. It gets characterized as easy as flipping the switch. And really, it's a little more complicated than that, right? Because there are a whole lot of reasons why we use night lighting. And we just need to start thinking about how we can design it and use it better. We're going to talk first tonight about dark skies and the importance of preserving them. And then I'm going to talk briefly about window collisions. But to start with, this is a photo of Crater Lake. I'm sure folks recognize this, again, by Haroon Memedinovich. And for about 4.5 billion years, there was no artificial light on this planet, artificial electric light on this planet. And virtually all of our biological systems evolved under these regular cycles of dark nights and bright days. And that set up our circadian rhythms, which is essentially the system that governs all of our biological processes. Unfortunately, this probably looks familiar to folks. In the last 130 years or so, we have changed all that with the installation of electric lights on our city streets and then the proliferation of that. And today, over 80% of people in the United States live in urban areas and under light polluted skies. So they no longer know that natural rhythm of bright days and truly dark nights. This is something called the Bortle scale. It was developed in 2001 by a guy named John Bortle. And what this is a tool for amateur astronomers to compare the relative darkness of their observation sites. So if you read this from right to left, you can see over there on the right is an excellent dark sky. So class 1 dark sky site. Places in Oregon that have skies like this are the Alvord Desert, Steens Mountain, Summer Lake, Hart Mountain. Hopefully folks have been to some of these places and really experienced those magical skies. And then as you read this scale from right to left, you see the increasing influence of light pollution on that sky, all the way over here to the left where you find Portland, Eugene, and Salem, kind of on that cusp between an 8 and 9 inner city sky site and a 7 city of urban transition site. So we will look at this on a map. Essentially, this is more or less what that looks like on a map. This is an image taken from the New World Atlas of Artificial Night Sky Brightness, which was developed in 2016 by a team of Italian astronomers and some NOAA researchers. And what they used was visual infrared imaging to map light pollution around the world. This is obviously an excerpt of the United States. You can see that east of the Mississippi, they are much worse off than we are west of the Mississippi. We have plenty of light pollution, don't get me wrong, but we still have dark sky that we can preserve, and there's not a whole lot left of that in the contiguous United States east of the Mississippi. And then there's a pullout just of Oregon in the lower left here, and you can see that there's almost a continuous band of light pollution from Portland down through the Roseburg and Medford area. And those are obviously cities along the I-5 corridor. Now, when these scientists developed this map, they overlaid it with census data. And what they found was that 99% of people in the United States live under light polluted skies, and 80% of people can't see the Milky Way from home. Pretty sobering statistics. I mean, that is most people, right? And this is how we get there. So this is how we tend to light our nights, particularly in urban environments. We tend to use lighting that is not shielded, that's too bright, and that's on all night long. So these are all examples from Portland. In the upper left-hand corner is what I like to call the Luke Skywalker lightsaber. This is a City of Portland park in Southwest Portland, really unfortunately lit with these glowing orbs that create a lot of glare that make it hard for you to see. When you've stared at this light and then gone into a darker area, your eyes are now conditioned to being in a bright area. The City of Portland tends to use those lights there in the middle as well. And what you're looking at is a light post with an LED lamp at the top of the pole shining up at that squarish disc, which means that when you're above that light, you can actually see all of the light that is escaping around the sides of that disc. It is not properly shielding that light and keeping it down on the ground where it's useful, but sending a lot of it up into the sky. Upper right-hand corner and lower left-hand corner, those are parking lot lights, empty parking lots taken in the middle of the night. Why are those lit like that, right? These are sources of light pollution we just don't need. And then of course, billboards. All over Portland, our billboards tend to be lit from the bottom up, which is fairly typical, but it's not an absolute. It is absolutely possible to light a billboard from the top down. I've seen a lot of these, particularly in Costa Rica and other places that I visited, where they make more sensible decisions about how to light these kinds of things. Folks probably know that we are in an era of mass conversion of lighting from high pressure sodium to LED. And that's happening globally. LEDs are great. They're energy efficient. They're really long lived. They're relatively low maintenance. maybe even maintenance free. But the problem is that early generation LEDs produced a lot of what is called blue rich white light. And we haven't done a very good job of graduating from those early generation LEDs to all of the products that are available now. And believe me, LEDs have come a long way since they were originally invented. So if you look in the upper left-hand corner there, this is the spectral output of a 4,000 Kelvin LED. That is just a color relative warmth rating system that we use to describe LED lamps. And most of these 4,000 Kelvin bulbs and those that are rated even higher produce this blue spike in the blue portion of the spectrum over there on the left-hand side of the graph. Those photons in that blue portion of the spectrum, those have a lot more energy than photons further to the right at the warmer end of the spectrum, which means that they end up bouncing around a lot more. They end up in the atmosphere, bouncing off gas particles and other particulates, and they contribute more to light pollution. So that doesn't help LEDs reduce the light pollution that we are creating on the ground when we convert to them. And all of the early modeling when we were thinking about moving to LEDs suggested that we were going to start decreasing light pollution planet-wide. And that has not come true. What's happening is that we're seeing on average a 2 to 6% increase in light pollution per year around the globe. Now, there are some places that have lower rises in light pollution and some places that have drastically higher rises in light pollution. But in general, we're seeing a 2 to 6% rise. In part, that's because we see a lot of this blue rich white light installed. And in part, it's because it's so inexpensive to run that we have a tendency to install and use more of it. We think more is better. We think, well, if it's cheap to run, I may as well just run more of it. And that contributes to increases in light pollution. So part of the problem here is that spike, that blue spike on the left-hand side of the spectral output graph, that happens to be right about where birds and other mammals have their peak sensitivity to light, right about 450 nanometers. It's also where we have our peaks, humans have their peak sensitivity to light. This suppresses melatonin secretion into your system, and that makes it harder for you to sleep. So the American Medical Association has actually come out with concerns about this kind of light used in outdoor lighting at night. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So ecological light pollution is a huge and growing field of study because when we introduce artificial light into the nocturnal environment, we really start to upset these very carefully choreographed relationships between all of the members of these complicated ecosystems. And some things that can result from that are skewing the timing of breeding and nesting patterns, migration, foraging in plants, things like bud burst and leaf drop, confusing celestial navigation. This is oftentimes something we think about when we are talking about migrating birds, but it can also happen with things like dung beetles and other critters. It can cause misorientation in nocturnal movements. We see this primarily, most famously, with Pacific sea turtles that are hatching on the beach. We'll talk a little bit about that. It can result in attraction or repulsion behaviors depending on the species. Bats are very susceptible to being influenced by light pollution. Some of the faster flyers will actually hang out around streetlights night after night, habitually hawking insects there. Some of the slower flyers will actually be repelled by light. It's like habitat fragmentation for them. They won't go anywhere near it because it's too dangerous for them. Reduced fledgling success in nesting birds we see with white light LEDs, reduced disease immunity, and we're going to talk about some research on that. It can interfere with predator-prey relationships because this is like more than full moonlight being introduced into the nocturnal system night after night after night. And it can even extend the activity of diurnal species into nighttime hours. So some of that might seem like it would be good news for some species, but it really isn't good news. There are hundreds and hundreds of peer-reviewed published papers now looking at the impacts of light pollution on everything from individual species to whole ecosystems. And none of it is good news. I've not read a single paper that says this is good news for any species or any ecosystem. And the impacts of light pollution have actually been demonstrated in somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 species and representatives from every taxa. So just a few examples on the screen right now that I don't have time to go into deep depth about, but I just want to make mention of. So dung beetles use the Milky Way to orient themselves from a dung pile back to their homes. And if you blot out the Milky Way for them, they roll their dung balls in circles. So when stars are washed out by light pollution, that spells real trouble for dung beetles. Lodestar orientation has been demonstrated in harbor seals. This is a species that is navigating through open waters, in many cases without terrestrial landmarks. So they use stars to navigate. So what happens to them when we wash out the night sky? That middle photo on the top, Pacific sea turtles. So female sea turtles return to their natal beaches every year. They crawl up onto dry sand, they dig a pit, they lay eggs in that pit and they bury it and they leave, and they're not coming back to take care of those sea turtles. The sea turtles will develop in their eggs and then they will group dig out of that pit. And their one job at this point is to get out to the ocean. And prior to there being artificial light on the planet, the brightest horizon would always be the horizon over the ocean, where there was either a moon or there were stars, creating a fair bit of light at night. But now that we've introduced light onto city streets and uphill from beaches, sea turtles have a tendency to dig out of their pits and head up toward whatever the artificial lighting situation is up the beach. They're never going to make it. And they already have, at best, probably a 25% chance of survival. So this spells real trouble for them. Luckily, there's been a lot of work done to help make sure that we're improving our lighting around sea turtle habitat. Reduced fledgling success. So there have been studies that have shown elevated corticosterone levels or stress hormones in birds nesting under experimental white lights. And those stress hormones translate to successfully fledging fewer young. Circadian perturbance in monarch butterflies. We tend to think about light pollution primarily impacting nocturnal species, but in fact, there are impacts to diurnal species as well. So monarch butterflies are migrating based on day length, and when they are exposed to artificial light at night, they get confused about what time of year it is, how long the days are, and when they're supposed to be heading out. So we're starting to see these guys get in trouble. Now, light pollution alone is not something that we think of as deadly, but it does create a compounding factor for species that are already in trouble because of habitat loss, climate change, pesticides, you name it, right? We're just adding one more stressor onto their lives. Predator-prey relationships. So there are very carefully balanced relationships between things like owls and their mouse prey. So owls actually have better success hunting as more light is available, but their prey species also reduce their activity under full moon conditions. So again, when we start creating full moon conditions and brighter every night of the year, what are we doing to that balanced relationship? We're suppressing the activity of those prey species to the detriment of the owls, and incidentally to the detriment of those prey species as well, because they need to be out foraging, finding mates, establishing new territories, things like that. Kind of similar story here with, this is an eastern red-backed salamander. We have the cousin of that species here in the west. It's the western red-backed salamander, but the eastern red-backed salamander has been shown to delay emergence from leaf litter by at least an hour at night, even just under dim white string lights. So it doesn't take much to tell them that they better stay under cover longer. And that reduces their ability to forage and find mates and establish new territories. Decreased connectivity and habitat fragmentation, I mentioned this already, but slow flying bats practice avoidance of light pollution. So we're actually, it's just like habitat fragmentation when we are introducing light at night in environments where bats are trying to forage. And then light attraction. So that lower right-hand photo, that's not snow. Those are grasshoppers. I don't know if you remember a few years ago where there was this macro attraction of grasshoppers to Las Vegas, which I think is considered the brightest city on earth. But so there's one drawback to having so much light pollution, right? I don't think anybody was having a good time when all these grasshoppers were in town. Okay, so let's talk about bird migration. Most birds migrate at night. So of 70% of our North American species are migratory, and 80% of those species migrate at night. So hawks don't migrate at night, but many, many other species, a few songbirds migrate during the day, but most are migrating at night. And the reason they do that is because the atmosphere is less turbulent, it's cooler, they can preserve daytime hours for foraging, they can avoid diurnal predators by doing this. So this is a gross generalization, but they'll take off about 30 to 45 minutes after sunset. And if conditions are good, they're going to fly all night long, and they're going to orient themselves with where the sun went down, also using the North Star or Polaris and Orion or the Big Dipper, depending on what's available for them. And they'll fly all night long unless they come into areas where there's a lot of light pollution, and then they get into trouble. So folks may remember this top example. This is the Standard Insurance building in Galveston, Texas. And in May of 2017, almost 400 birds collided with this building as they came across the Gulf, just in one fell swoop. 3 of those birds survived and were taken to rehab, and subsequently the Standard Insurance building elected to participate in the Lights Out program for the remainder of the season. I haven't really heard, I assume they are probably continuing to participate in the Lights Out program, but those birds were just exhausted coming across the Gulf and just attracted right to this building, and they slammed directly into it. The lower example is the NASCAR Hall of Fame building in Charlotte, North Carolina. In fall of 2019, a little over 300 chimney swifts slammed into this building, another mass collision. Now, in many cases, we aren't seeing mass collisions like this. What we're seeing are birds that are attracted into lit areas, be they urban or oil fields in Texas, something like that. They're attracted into these lit areas, and then they face secondary hazards, the top among them being cats and window collisions. So we really want to try to keep birds aloft and on their migratory pathways. And luckily, we do have tools that we didn't used to have. So we have lights out alerts now. Colorado State University's Aero Eco Lab uses radar technology to study the movements of birds and study climate conditions. And they layer these on top of each other, and they come up with forecasts for when we're going to have really big migration pushes. Cornell Lab does something similar with Birdcast. And then what we do as Audubon chapters is we help broadcast this information locally. So we get the word out to folks that we're going to have a huge movement of birds. And this is a really good night to turn off any unnecessary lighting around your house, on your buildings downtown. And then there's this migration dashboard, which is the lower figure there, that you can check in real time or the next day to see how many birds actually passed over an area. We had some nights this past spring when there were somewhere on the order of 4 to 5 million birds forecasted to fly over the state of Oregon. And the next day, when I checked the migration dashboard, I found something like 21 million birds had passed over the state. So really staggering numbers. And then what we hope to do is help people start to think about whether they can make more permanent changes to their lighting. If you can turn off any unnecessary lighting on these big migration nights, can you turn off unnecessary lighting every night of the year, or at least for the full duration of migration, which honestly is at least 3 months in spring and at least 3 months in fall. What we focus on are the peak months in spring and fall. So there's one peak month in spring, April 15th to May 19th, and there's one peak month in fall, September 19th through October 19th. So this is an example of purple martins. Excuse me just a moment. I think you all have been having wildfire smoke down here as well. I heard yesterday on NPR that Portland and Seattle had the worst air quality for the last 2 weeks of any large city in the world. So my throat is feeling it, but I know you've had wildfires down here as well. So there was a fairly recent study done on purple martins looking at light pollution in their overwintering habitats. And what researchers found was that birds on average were exposed to at least one night of light pollution, regardless of where they were overwintering. And birds that were exposed to 10 nights or more of light pollution shortly in spring, shortly before they were going to make their migration journeys, they left their overwintering grounds 8 days earlier than they ordinarily would. And then their compatriots did if they were overwintering in areas that didn't have a lot of light pollution. They also arrived 8 days earlier at their breeding grounds. So to some extent, we might think, well, this gives them a jump on getting the best nesting territories. But honestly, it puts them at great risk of showing up too early when there aren't insects that can support them either surviving themselves or starting to raise young or having enough fat put on to support this very, very intense metabolic process of raising young, right? So this is a diurnal species. This is not a nocturnal migrant. And yet light pollution on their overwintering grounds is affecting their migration patterns. This is a really interesting study that came out of Meredith Kernbaugh's lab at University of South Florida, where she took 50 English house sparrows. We all know those. They're very common urban bird species. And she injected all of them with West Nile virus. And then she split the group into two. And one of those groups she kept as a control group, and she allowed them to spend the night in total darkness. And the other half of the group she subjected to dim light at night. And what she found was that the birds that were exposed to artificial light at night, even though it was quite dim, took twice as long to kick the West Nile virus in their systems down to a level that they could no longer transmit it to mosquitoes. So that has really important implications for something that is a zoonotic disease that none of us want. You do not want to get West Nile virus. So if we have a common urban bird species that is generally going to be exposed to artificial light at night, they are potentially going to be carriers of West Nile virus if they get exposed to it for a longer period than birds that are allowed to spend the night in darkness. I don't know if anybody saw this, but in 2018, there was a climate science special report that was made to Congress. There were over 300 contributors to it. And what they included in this climate assessment was a chapter on the Pacific Northwest. And in that chapter, they warned that we can expect with climate change, warmer temperatures, more mosquitoes, more West Nile virus, and more people getting infected and dying. So when you put that last study into the context of climate change, we start to have a compounding issue. It's not just about whether house sparrows are gonna persist in the environment. Yes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about human health. There is, first of all, a lot that we don't know yet. There's a lot of research happening looking at the impacts of light pollution on human health. What we do know is that we have non-image forming cells in our eyes that are sensitive to that blue, rich white light that I was talking about earlier. And when that light hits our eyes, it tells our brains that it's time to wake up. That's why it's great if you go into your office in the morning and you have bright bluish colored light or daylight. It essentially mimics daylight. That tells your brain it's time to wake up, be clear-headed, get a lot done. But you don't want to be exposed to this kind of light at night. And unfortunately, we are seeing the installation of more and more of this kind of light in external applications primarily, though we also see it in internal applications. And you know, the thing is, your brain is not discriminating about where that blue light comes from. So it could be your cell phone, it could be your computer. I'm sure we've all heard, don't go to bed with your devices, right? Or if you do, wear blue blocking glasses, wear a pair of red sunglasses, or there are programs on our cell phones, there are programs on our computers that dial that blue light down. Hopefully some of you are aware of that and you have those turned to on your devices if you're exposing yourself to those at night, and if you have trouble sleeping. So now if you add street lights to this and you have a blue rich white street light that's shining into your bedroom window, you are creating more and more additive reasons for melatonin to be suppressed in your system. The American Medical Association in 2016 came out with a report recommending that municipalities avoid the installation of blue rich white light on city streets at night. And they cited concerns about both breast and prostate cancers, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, retinal damage, because this kind of light, if you look directly at it, can cause discomfort glare, but also disability glare. So it can actually be dangerous, especially if you're driving or if you're walking down the street at night and you're exposed to this kind of light, and then you enter a dark area where you can't see your footing or you can't see somebody hiding in the bushes. So it doesn't actually promote safety. And so they recommended that municipalities move toward warmer exterior lighting when doing these conversions. This is a really fun slide. I don't expect anybody to read this. But in February of 2022, the Department of Energy put out this solid state lighting report. Solid state lighting is essentially LEDs. And historically, the Department of Energy has cared about one thing and one thing only, and that is energy efficiency. And so it is really heartening to see in this 2022 report that they are starting to address human health concerns as well as wildlife impacts. So everything that I've highlighted in yellow here is just kind of a few words that they are mentioning about human health, about needing to take this into consideration as we are designing our lighting systems, needing to impact wildlife impact, reduce wildlife impacts when we are designing our lighting systems, and also recognizing that most installations these days don't follow best practices in lighting design, and that we really need to come into alignment with this if we want to start reducing our impacts. We always have to talk about public safety because obviously that is one of the key reasons why we have light at night, for circulation and activity and for safety. But we tend to think that more light equals more safety. And the reality is that more is not necessarily better. We really need to be designing our lighting more thoughtfully, because if you have overly bright lighting, as I just mentioned, then you are in an area that's a pool of light, your eyes adjust to that. And then if you're walking into an area adjacent to that that's relatively dark, it is very difficult for your eyes to adjust to that, particularly in the aging eye. And when I say in the aging eye, the science on this is over 40. So, you know, it starts pretty young that your eye becomes slower to react to changes in light. And that can create real safety issues. If we create pools of light with deep, dark shadows, that provides concealment areas for criminals. And an example of that here is this pair of photos on the bottom. On the left-hand side, you can see that there's an unshielded light that the photographer is looking at. With the simple action of raising a hand to cover that glare bomb, suddenly the camera lens is able to focus on the person who's standing there in that left-hand photo too, by the way. But the camera lens, kind of like our eyes, is going to be adjusted to that brighter light in the foreground. And then you can't see that there's somebody standing there. The other thing is motion censored lighting is much better for deterring crime because you have the element of surprise for one thing. For another thing, I have my front porch light on a motion sensor. If I notice that the front porch light has flashed on, I know that there's either somebody on my porch or maybe there's a raccoon on my porch. But either way, I'm probably going to check it out. And that actually helps raise my awareness about my own safety at home as well. There have not been a ton of studies looking at the relationship between lighting and crime. But there is a handful, there's a handful of studies. I want to point out a couple here in the middle that I've highlighted in yellow. The first one is the Chicago Alley Lighting Project. This was prepared by the Illinois Criminal Justice Authority. And what they did was they increased both the frequency and the wattage of lighting on select alleyways in Chicago. And then they compared crime rates before and after they made that lighting change. And they found a 21% increase in crime. Now, what they cannot evaluate for certain is how much of that is about an increased reporting of crime. So it's probably some combination of that. But what they didn't find was a reduction in crime as a result of installing all this increased lighting. The next block there is preventing crime, what works, what doesn't, what's promising. This is from the National Institute of Justice. And this is a direct quote from that report. Is street lighting an effective approach in the reduction and deterrence of crime? The answer is inconclusive. We have very little confidence that improved lighting prevents crime. Now, this is obviously a very nuanced field, but my point to you is that we have to start complicating the narrative about it. We have to start thinking a little bit more critically about the difference between more light and more thoughtfully designed lighting. There's a lot more to say about that, but I'm gonna leave it at that for now. I want to mention equity and environmental justice because this is an emerging field of study. These are just a couple of reports that have come out within the last couple of years. The top one there, cross-sectional association between outdoor artificial light at night and sleep duration in middle to older age adults. And they found, in fact, that yes, higher levels of artificial light at night were associated with shorter sleep for folks. And also that the associations between artificial light at night and sleep were larger in neighborhoods with higher levels of poverty. The next study, light pollution inequities in the continental United States, a distributive environmental justice analysis, they found relationships between race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status and light pollution. And in fact, what they found was that Asian, Hispanic, and Black Americans had twice the exposure levels to artificial light at night in their neighborhoods as white Americans. They also found that neighborhoods with higher proportions of Black, Hispanic, and Asian Americans or renter occupants had higher levels of artificial light at night that they were exposed to. So this is an equity issue. Again, a complicated issue. In many cases, we're probably talking about denser neighborhoods, high density residential housing, closer to arterials that are lit more brightly, but also properties that probably have less large trees on them and dense landscaping, maybe even communities that are less able to afford window coverings on their windows. I know that installing room darkening curtains in my room cost me $1,000. So I'm lucky enough to be able to afford that, but not everybody is, right? I also, as a homeowner, can choose to plant a large shade tree in the front of my house that provides a buffer between my bedroom windows and the street light out front. Not everybody can make that decision, especially if they're renter, occupants, or low income. So something to think about. We are living in a time of climate change. I think it's probably abundantly clear to everybody in this room. And this is low-hanging fruit. We know that lighting accounts for about 1/5 of the world's energy use, and that outdoor lighting is about 13% of residential energy use. That's a lot, 13% for outdoor lighting. That is very significant. The International Dark Sky Association estimates that somewhere between 35 and 50% of light is wasted nationwide. That's because it's poorly designed. And that translates to $3 to $5 billion a year of energy loss and 21 million tons a year of CO2 emissions. So this is nothing to sneeze at. And if we think about just eliminating unused light, unnecessary lighting, empty parking lot lighting, things like that, we could probably go a long way towards reducing some of this influence of light pollution, energy waste on climate change. There are best practices that have been developed by the International Dark Sky Association and the Illuminating Engineering Society. They are fairly straightforward and hopefully rather intuitive. Minimize any unnecessary lighting, fully shield it, make sure it's aimed down. So you don't want to be looking at any bulbs and you don't want any light to be cast directly up into the sky. Also limit the total brightness. We have a tendency, especially with the use of LEDs, to use much brighter lighting than is really necessary. So can you dial that? Can you dim it down? Can you dial that wattage down? Choose warm colors. So choose a yellower light as opposed to a really bright white light, particularly for applications at night. And then again, use motion sensors and dimmers. It's better for energy use anyway. I think the question that we are all thinking when we're talking about lighting design is, can we maintain really beautiful, inviting, vibrant, safe spaces in our urban environments, in our built environments, and simultaneously reduce light pollution in the night sky? And the answer is absolutely yes, we can do it. And here are just a few examples. So the upper left-hand photo is taken from a public outdoor space in Tacoma, Washington, called the Prairie Line, where they've used really nice, subtle lighting that creates a beautiful sense of space and doesn't create a ton of light pollution. A couple of other pathway examples there in the upper right that I can't actually cite to a particular project, but I think that those are enough to inspire your imagination about how pathway lighting can really be fairly subtle and still create safe spaces that you want to be in. And then the three photos along the bottom, the two on the left are from a park in Houston, Texas. Gorgeous lighting. I want to go on a date there, don't you? I don't want to be bathed in all kinds of overly bright white lighting if I go on a walk, you know, even in a very urban city. The lower right-hand photo there is from Vancouver, BC, waterfront. Look at how gorgeous that ambient lighting is. It's not casting a bunch of light pollution up into the sky. Those are just a few examples. I want to mention, I'm also on the board of the Oregon chapter of the International Dark Sky Association, and a couple of my esteemed colleagues on that board have this amazing project called the Oregon Sky Glow Measurement Network. And what they are using are these sky quality meters. Unihedron is the manufacturer. And these are measuring light pollution at night. They're pointed right up toward the sky. The lower photo here, that's the unit itself. That little eyeball is the thing that's capturing light at night. It is stored in this weatherproof housing that you see there on the right. In some cases, they're on T-posts on fence lines. Mine is on my shed roof in my backyard. And there are now 39 of them distributed around Oregon. There are 17 more in discussion. This project started back in 2019 in the Bend area as a pilot project, and all of the stars, it's going to be a little bit hard for folks in the back to see this, but all of the stars there represent existing dark sky quality meters. The little round dots represent areas where we either have a potential host or we hope to find a host. Down here, we have a bunch of state parks that are hopefully about to get into the mix. Oregon State Parks has been really amazing at championing this idea and ultimately pursuing International Dark Sky Place designation, because they recognize that the night sky is a natural resource and something that they can provide to visitors. A lot more people are starting to travel out of urban environments in part to see the night sky. So state parks are a really amazing place to do that. Crater Lake National Park, obviously another amazing place to see that. We just got a dark sky quality meter installed there this past summer. Zooming in on Eugene, in the summer of 2021, the Eugene Astronomical Society helped with the installation of 3 dark sky quality meters. One of those on private property in Junction City, one of those in Lowell, and one of them at Mount Pisgah. There is also hope to get one installed at Sheldon High School. Student astronomy club students at Sheldon High School are championing this idea. Some other ideas that IDA Oregon has would be to maybe get one at the University of Oregon, contributing to this incredible data set that we have going, and then to try to find hosts in Corvallis, Albany, and Lebanon. Now, these units are about $300 a pop. And these days we are asking the hosts to foot that bill, but I'm also seeking grant sources that can help us potentially offset that cost. And the data has to be downloaded once every 3 months. But I'm really not a tech person and it's quite easy to do. So if anybody has any big ideas in this room, find me after. So this is another light pollution map that was put together by Night Sky Metrics for the Oregon IDA chapter. And first, what we're looking at here is 2012 data, looking at light pollution around the state of Oregon. And so this is essentially the same scale that we saw earlier. White and red is going to be the worst on this map, and black is going to be the best. So now we're looking at 2020 data. So I invite you to maybe first take a look at Eugene in 2012. So downtown coming in at red there. Now we jump to 2020. Uh-oh, you guys have gone white. Also that kind of yellowish area and an orange area around not quite city center has also expanded. So do you see that? We're also shrinking some of those darker blue areas, which are still starry night skies. Portland, obviously, that white area grows, that red area grows. We spread all the way to Salem. You know, so this is really interesting data that is showing the advance of light pollution. This is an 8-year time elapse map. So where are we going to be in another 8 years? How far are you going to have to go to see a starry night sky? I want to mention this very cool project that was done at the University of Washington. It was actually done by University of Washington students. They put together a campus illumination report. And what they did was they laid out a vision for the future lighting campus-wide, how to make it cohesive and connected, how to best plan for safety for students navigating this campus, how to also minimize ecological impacts at the same time. So it's always going to be a balancing act. We need light at night for safety and circulation, but can we make sure that we're really thinking about how we minimize our impacts on the natural environment? Anyway, just an idea for the University of Oregon. I would love to see every campus in the nation do this. So supporting dark skies. In the Portland area, we have something called the Take the Pledge to Go Lights Out program, where we ask folks to enroll in the program, do a simple evaluation of their home lighting, look for opportunities to reduce it where they can. They get a free metal yard sign that they can hang up in their yard. It helps raise awareness. I don't know if folks in Eugene get really into yard signs, but in Portland, we have our backyard habitat certification program. We have a pesticide-free yard sign program. People in Portland love their yard signs. So this is kind of an incentive to get folks going on it. And then they get on an action alert list and they receive alerts about these big migration movement nights. We also hit them up if we're looking to try to get something through city council or other agency level action alerts that we're sending out. So something that the city of Eugene or Lane County Audubon Society could consider doing as you enter into what is potentially going to be a bird-friendly community program. Things that folks can do in the Eugene area: participate in Lane County Audubon Society's Lights Out program. Make sure you're sharing those with your networks, whether it's your neighbors or on your social media, so we really help get the word out. Support stronger lighting standards in the city of Eugene. I don't know if this is even on the radar map for city council, but they really want to see their constituents supporting any of the initiatives they take on. So I'm sure you all know this, but it matters to talk to your elected officials about what's important to you. Also, we have made a run at state legislation. It didn't pass. I didn't actually even get a hearing in the last session. We're making another run at it this time. We may not get it again, but these processes are all iterative. We really have to sometimes go at these a few times before we get traction. But it's meaningful to have Audubon Society members around the state support something like that. And it really would just apply to state properties. Lobbying the University of Oregon to incorporate BirdSafe standards into their green building policy, and also to do something like develop a campus illumination plan. It's huge to have campuses engage in things like that. I mean, these are areas of intense learning. They're on the cutting edge of innovation. You have young people who believe anything is possible. They're not tired and jaded like us, right? So these are prime places to start to do really cool, innovative work. And then, as I mentioned, if you're interested in hosting an SQM, if you live in any of the areas that I mentioned, or if you have affiliations with U of O, let's talk. A sky quality meter, dark sky quality meter. So that's that IDA Oregon program that I mentioned, where we have 39 dark sky quality meters distributed around the state, which are tracking changes in night sky conditions over time. I didn't share trends from that yet because not all of the sky quality meters have been in place long enough to actually be reporting trends yet, but sometime that will be available. I want to talk really briefly about collisions because I would be remiss if I didn't, as they are tightly tied to light pollution. Folks probably know that we have an estimated up to 1 billion birds per year that die as a result of hitting a building. That is third only to habitat destruction and cats. So this is a really important conservation issue for our birds. And we know because of that report that came out of Cornell a couple years ago that we have lost about 30% of our North American migratory bird population in the last 50 years. So our birds are in trouble. And window collisions are something we can actually change. We can actually reduce. So birds don't actually see glass as an obstruction in their flyway. They either see reflections of sky and vegetation, or they see through glass to habitat on the other side, and they think they can fly right through it. Birds are also, as you know, accustomed to navigating pretty small pathways. I mean, not golden eagles or red-tailed hawks, but small birds are accustomed to flying through small areas in vegetation. So it doesn't take a huge plate glass window to be deadly for birds. Most collisions actually happen within the first 40 to 60 feet above ground. That's because that's where birds are spending most of their time, flying around, foraging, nesting, meeting other birds of their kind. And things that increase risk are reflection of trees and vegetation in glass, and also attractants like feeders and bird baths within areas where there are a lot of glass windows. There was a paper that came out in 2014 by Scott Lost. It was a metadata study looking at 93,000 strike records across the United States. And what they found when they looked at this data was that 56% of all collisions are happening at low-rise buildings. So buildings that are 4 to 11 stories high. 44% of collisions are happening at 1 to 3 story residences. So even lower scale buildings, and less than 1% are happening at high rises. Now that's not because high rises are not a risk factor for birds. It's because there are so many fewer of them on the landscape. There are many more low rise buildings and residential buildings. And so that's creating this massive hazard across the landscape, across the country. I want to mention that at our Wildlife Care Center at Portland Audubon, we have found a 63 to 79% mortality in birds that are brought into the clinic having struck a window. So this represents a very high mortality factor for birds. Many of them do not survive a collision. Even if you see a bird hit a window and then fly off, I hate to burst anybody's bubble, but it probably goes someplace else to die. The data just doesn't suggest that they are very likely to survive. And these are the kinds of windows that are creating hazards. So these are all single story buildings, and they all obviously have a lot of reflectivity or transparency on them. The upper right-hand building has been retrofitted after a year-long study between the city of Portland and Portland Audubon. And we reduced that strikes at that building by 94% by applying an exterior window film to it. The Oxbow Welcome Center, that's our Metro Regional Government building, set in very high value forest. They were warned repeatedly that they were going to have thrushes hitting that building left and right. They put it up anyway. They didn't treat the windows. They retrofitted it. So, you know, these single-story buildings are actually posing a very significant hazard. Dan Clem, who is probably the leading researcher on window collisions across the United States, suggests that somewhere between a quarter to half of all collisions leave absolutely no evidence and go undetected, even at buildings that are heavily monitored. That's because not all birds are going to leave dander prints like this lower left-hand photo. Those are mostly doves and pigeons. Some waterfowl will leave dander prints, but many birds don't. The lower right-hand photo is a couple of feathers on a window, easily overlooked. And carcasses of birds are so much smaller than their animated counterparts that they just disappear when they fall into vegetation on the ground, or they land on canopies or behind fence lines, or scavengers come and pick them up. So many window collisions just go totally undetected. What you have to do is put some kind of visual marker on the glass that alerts birds that there is a barrier there. There's something called the 2x4 rule that has more recently been morphed into the 2x2 rule. So you have to put some kind of pattern on the glass that covers the entire pane, and it needs to be spaced no more than 2 inches apart vertically and no more than 2 inches apart horizontally. So that could be a simple line pattern. It could be a dot pattern. That pattern can cover as little as 6% of the window and still be very effective at reducing collisions. There's an example of it there on the left, probably a little bit hard to see for folks in the back. The left-hand photo is a little bit more obvious with that black line pattern. These are some commercial applications. So acid etched glass there in the upper left, that's a 6% density pattern. The middle photograph there is a frit pattern on a building in Portland South Waterfront. That was designed into that glass to reduce solar heat gain, so to reduce the demand on air conditioning in that building. And secondarily, it also helps reduce collisions at that building. We monitored it back in the days when we were doing collision monitoring. The upper right-hand photo is a UV pattern on glass, not as effective because not all birds can see into the UV spectrum, and because UV patterns are only effective if there's enough UV light in the atmosphere to reflect off of that pattern. So on a gloomy Pacific Northwest winter day, that pattern's going to disappear. And then any bird that can't see into the UV spectrum isn't going to see it anyway. Exterior approaches are also very effective at reducing birds flying into glass and also at reducing the cooling demand on a building. So those are 3 examples of that along the bottom. The 2 on the left were not designed with birds in mind. The one on the right, I'm sorry, the one in the middle was designed with birds in mind as well. The Tracy Aviary is the lower right-hand corner in Salt Lake City. They obviously designed that building to be bird friendly. Just to give you a quick example of how we went about this in Portland, we ran surveys of window collisions in the greater Portland area from 2009 to 2011. In 2012, we developed a voluntary resource guide. We brought architects and designers and planners in on this process so that we would have buy-in and raise awareness. We published that. Then in 2013, we got a city council resolution that the city itself would incorporate BirdSafe tactics wherever possible in new development. By 2015, that translated into a requirement in the city of Portland's green building policy that they would incorporate BirdSafe, both glass and lighting, into their projects. So it was kind of an iterative project. By 2018, we actually got it codified as an ordinance in the city of Portland. So the downtown area and the south reach of the Willamette River, you have to design to BirdSafe standards if you have more than 30% glass on any one facade. And most buildings do have more than 30% glass on their facades. Portland is not alone in this. There are many other North American cities that have done this, beginning with Toronto and San Francisco. But most recently, Evanston. Prior to that, New York City. All buildings, all 5 bureaus up to 75 feet have to be designed to BirdSafe standards now. We have a tips page on Portland Audubon's website. I'm not actually sure if Lane County Audubon has something like this. One of the easiest things that you can do to reduce window hazards is place your feeders very close to your windows. I know that seems counterintuitive, but if birds get spooked off of a feeder or a water feature in your yard, and it is very close to the window, they don't have the momentum to kill themselves when they hit that window. So this left-hand photo, that's my cat and my dog enjoying that Anna's hummingbird, who doesn't seem to mind them at all. That bird is perfectly happy to be on bird TV, and it's really entertaining for the dog and the cat. You can also mark your windows. You can do lots of DIY things like cut out your own decals. They have to be positioned pretty densely on the window in order to be effective, but certainly doing something is better than doing nothing. So start with a few decals. If you have a problem window, add decals as needed to help reduce collisions. You can draw on your windows with oil-based paint pens like Sharpie pens, which is what you see in that upper right-hand corner if you're artistically inclined. You can buy decals. Those are store-bought decals on the upper left. Window screens, insect screens are actually the most effective thing you can do for the least cost because operable windows come with window screens. So make sure you have screens on your windows. Paracord hanging down in front of the windows will tell birds that there's an obstacle there. Not everybody's choice, but very cost effective. And then you can even just put a simple dot pattern on your windows. That's Kaleidoscape there in the bottom right-hand corner. All of these things need to be done to the outside of the window to be really effective. Okay, that's it. You can ask me about condors now. Thanks for sitting through that. And I'm of course really happy to talk about dark skies or collisions. Sure, yeah. Over here.
Yeah, just so you know, Eugene does have outdoor lighting standards in its land use code. I helped write them 20+ years ago. Most people don't know about them. They're largely enforced. When I turn lights in, that need to be fixed. Oh, sometimes the city responds, sometimes it doesn't. So, if you get this presentation to the UVO where I teach, same thing. Just don't get it. They keep installing and just changed, and some vehicles have changed from bad lights to even worse lights. And so it's really important what you're doing, getting the word out. This was an outstanding presentation. So thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, I don't know if everybody in the room heard this or if folks on Zoom heard, but essentially we have a planner in the room who helped write lighting standards for the city of Eugene 25 years ago. They are largely unenforced, it sounds like, and it sounds like there's a sentiment that maybe a lot of people just don't get it. We continue to add bad lighting and we don't necessarily think about the ramifications. And I think that's true in most cases. Rarely ever is somebody installing lighting, bad lighting with malicious intent. But one thing that I think is really surprising is that there are plenty of projects that are designed by qualified lighting designers, and they're terrible. And I don't understand it. I mean, brand new buildings in the city of Portland that have glare bombs all over the building. And that a lighting designer was brought in on these huge projects. And yet we still get this lighting that is bad for our eyes, bad for our ability to navigate, bad for security. So it's kind of baffling. Yeah. And I think there just needs to be a lot more awareness raising about it. Anyway, yes, thank you. It's interesting. I know I haven't recently looked for Eugene lighting standards, but I looked for them a number of years ago and didn't find them. And if you're telling me they've been on the books for 25 years, then they might just be a little bit tough to find, which isn't unusual with city code, especially in land use planning.
It's so simple. You can light up your entire yard if you want to, but if somebody stands at the property line, you must not be able to see the source of the light. It's that simple. So
Is there anything about foot candle trespass onto neighboring yards?
Unfortunately, city council said, well, we should be concerned about pedestrians going by our houses, so let's let people have one porch light on. If it's not more than 1,500 lumens or something like that, but porch lights, not the porch lights.
Yeah,
They're way
yeah.
beyond that. It's not a porch light.
Yeah, I mean, I think porch lights can serve a good public service if they're done well, for sure. Well, yeah, that's unfortunate. In the city of Portland, we do have a foot candle trespass standard. However, it really only applies from commercially zoned property onto open space or residentially zoned property. So it's a pretty limited application, but a person in the city of Portland could make a complaint about a commercial building that's casting light off their property. Question in the back.
You have specific dates for migration periods. How far in advance are they going to stay the same each year or publicize it? How do you know that's going to be for spring?
Yeah, those dates actually come directly from Colorado State University's Eco Lab. Sorry, the question was, how do we know when peak migration is and how far in advance are we publishing them? So those dates are fairly static. They're based on research done by Colorado State University's Eco Lab and folks at Cornell University. They are likely to change, well, for a few reasons. I mean, we may have earlier peaks or later peaks for some reason. There could be weather events that start to morph those, and climate change may start to change where we see our peaks, but they are relatively static. So they're published. Yep. Any other questions? Yes, right here in the front row.
So they're getting their data, there's some kind of radar way for them to actually count. I know that like hawk routes in various places, they're manually counting, but obviously they're getting millions in their counts, so there's somehow this sonar or radar or whatever.
How do they do the counting?
Yeah, so the question is, how do the folks that are doing these alerts count birds? And the answer is that they are using Doppler weather radar stations, which were originally, I think, invented for enemy detection during World War II. At the time that they were used for that application, there was interference that was noticed, and that interference was primarily weather. So after World War II ended, this radar technology was put to use for weather tracking. And there are, I'm going to botch this number, I can't remember how many Doppler radar stations across the nation, a few hundred. And furthermore, what they've noticed is that birds show up. Birds, bats, and insects all show up on weather radars. And birds, in fact, have unique signatures. So they can tell small, medium, and large birds. They can't tell species. Sometimes you can hear them because there are some species that have flight calls that they use on migration pathways. So you might be able to say, there are Swainson's thrushes aloft tonight, or obviously Canada geese, cackling geese, some species we hear a lot. But yes, they're using radar technology to estimate numbers. Mm-hmm. Any last questions? Nobody has a condor question. That's fine.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just read in the New York Times a month ago about throwing in Iceland where they're throwing the baby puffins. Baby puffins are turned around so as they emerge from the burrows. They're attracted to the light of the cities. So they're flying away from the ocean into the city. And so people are doing through about a week-long period. They're all over the city picking up baby puffins, rescuing them, taking them to the cliffs and throwing them over.
Yeah, light pollution is obviously a huge issue for marine seabirds. That, if they head off in the wrong direction toward light pollution, they can run into buildings, but they can also just become grounded. And it's very difficult for many marine seabirds to get aloft if they're on flat ground, far away from a cliff, or the winds that might help pick them up. So yeah, it's quite an issue for marine seabirds. I didn't read that article, but interesting. Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you being here, and I hope you never look at lighting the same way again.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much, Mary. No, we will not look at lighting the same way. That was amazing. And thanks, Whitey, for your comments too. That was real helpful. Anyway, thank you all for coming tonight. Don't forget next month, Ron Papish on November 22nd, same place, same time. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.